Tachikaze is a clan in Vanguard that has continually gotten low to mid quality support since the release of Anger Blader back in V, with the restriction of Anger Blader to 1 shortly after that year's Worlds. While V Tachikaze is in turmoil, that is not the focus of today. We're talking about premium Tachikaze, and with it we got new support. Art Trader is the new history collection Eroded Stride that allows us to use Gaia Emperor as a boss card again, which opens up a lot more lines of play for the clan that we couldn't do before. Before you ask, does this mean we can use old G support? Unfortunately not. A lot of the high quality G support cards rely on a Vanguard with Engorge, which unfortunately Art Trader doesn't have. But instead of making the G support better for the current format, the addition of Art Trader actually makes a large plethora of V support better. A few cards that were considered low to mid quality are now mid to high quality cards in tandem with Gaia's on-stride skill. There have been 3 main Gaia variants that came out of History Collection so far. First off, we have Seal Magnum Loop. This deck utilizes the interaction between Gaia and Megarex or Tear the Rosino to draw through your entire deck until you hit deck out, so that you can call Seal Magnum over itself for infinite power. This deck usually has a minimum of 4 swings and a maximum of 8 swings depending on how you sequence your skills. Next up, we have the normal beatdown build where we just go very aggro, and it's very reminiscent of the V playstyle and prior to History Collection. This uses normal stuff like the Megarex, Regiodon, Blue Sprint combo with a splash of sometimes Mercenary, sometimes Sweeper, sometimes both. And it has an increased ceiling because you can revive Mercenary from Gaia's on-stride skill that allows you to swing for 27k or more about 2 to 4 times. And then the main focus of this video, Tyrannolegend. This deck was actually a deck idea that I saw come up within the Tachi Facebook group, and I thought that this would be something really cool to build upon. The thing that makes it work is Gaia giving Tyrannolegend a red text. So typically Tyrannolegend is locked behind being ridden or being called by an Ancient Dragon ability, but Gaia lets you get around that. Because Gaia gives the revive red text to Tyrannolegend, it's technically Tyrannolegend reviving itself, which means that Tyrannolegend itself will proc the front stack and the 10k and everything else that makes Tyrannolegend important. A deck around this would be, we take the aspect of the 2 previous decks and then we add in fronts. That basically solves all the issues with the deck. We'll be focusing on the Tyrannolegend variant and how it operates. So let's get into it. I'm going to be discussing the deck in sort of packages, and then we'll look at the rest of the deck outside these packages as well. A package could be defined as a small set of cards that work really well together for a very specific purpose. And a lot of the times, some of the cards overlap in each package. The more packages cards overlap into, the more powerful those cards are. For example, let's say we have a consistency package in this deck between Gaia Emperor, Tyrannolegend, and Megarex. The things these cards have in common is that Gaia enables Tyrannolegend and Megarex to keep drawing off of themselves. So for example, if you had 2 Megarex or 2 Tyrannolegend, you can keep retiring the other card and draw 4 cards total from just calling 2 cards onto the board. And so something like that is really strong in this deck, and as you can probably guess, cards like Tyrannolegend and Megarex also go with other cards, making them out to be much stronger in the deck than other cards would be. And so another example of a package in this deck would be the multi-attack package consisting of Regiodon, Blue Sprint, and Savage Shooter, along with either Megarex or Tyrannolegend. Regiodon and Blue Sprint facilitate the extra rearguard swings to durable rearguards, while Shooter can manipulate those gauges and allow you to either not gauge from deck or call a very specific card from your drop zone. This package is pretty self-explanatory as it's the core for a lot of Tachikaze decks, so I won't go too much further into it. Of course, we also have our resource package, so this is stuff that deals with your counterblast, your soul, and also your hand advantage. So the consistency package from earlier, the very first example, would also go into this, as those cards draw you cards, which allow you to sustain your hand. And along with that, we've added in cards like Freezer Nyx and Convalesce, as they feel your soul and let you countercharge for future turns. Soul is really needed in this list because of your Giganote of Pharaoh turns. If you don't have enough soul, then your turn's going to be a lot weaker, and then you wouldn't be able to call it a kill turn if you didn't have enough soul. Cards like these are going to be in the resource package. And then everything outside of these cards is considered techs. These aren't techs in the normal example of, oh, these are for very specific matchups, for very specific purposes. Cards like Dilopho Pyro or Prison Bird that add consistency to the deck and let you pop off a little harder. Dilopho Pyro, of course, lets you draw more cards, but also acts as a 19k beater if you call it off a gauge, which is really strong with Shooter and Reggie and Blue Sprint. And then Prison Bird, of course, gets you your grade 3s. We're running a split here so that Prison Bird V can get you grade 3s if you don't have any, and then Prison Bird G can act as stride fodder or get you that grade 3 you need to pitch for Arch Raider. And then of course we have our normal text, the text that you normally think about. Stuff I put in are Peeker and Staracalord. Peeker's there just for the resist really, like that's the only reason for the card. I don't want Sweeper in the deck because this deck doesn't like to gauge, but also Peeker has the inherent synergy of being able to defensively pump up your Vanguard's power, and that allows you to guard more efficiently. Staracalord, I just needed room to take out for Savage Guardians, and I thought, oh, I still like main deck PG, so I thought Staracalord would be nice. This deck really likes a lot of crits. Having Staracalord in the main deck slot helps me lower on the draw PG ratio, allows me to put in more crits, which is why you see 1 draw PG in my trigger lineup. Moving on to the G zone. This will definitely look very finicky at first glance, and I assure you these ratios will make sense after we go through all of them. Of course, first off, 2 Arch Raider. It's a history collection stride. You only need 2. There's no explanation there. 2 Gaia Devastate, mainly for the Chaos matchup and for any other matchups that have resist cards, because Gaia can get around the resist cards by targeting the circles. It also can play around your opponent being at 5 and you risking them hitting a heal to shut down your turn or OT. So this card getting that guaranteed crit lets you hit through that if they can't guard at all. Usually in these scenarios, you really only go into it if you know they can't guard or if the amount of guard that they're putting up is minimal. So just having this is a safe option. In addition, some decks don't like their board being wiped. If you go into the second stride, you can basically target the whole board. It's great. 2 Gluttony Dogma, mainly due to the fact that you don't gauge that much in this deck. Nebros usually is the forefront of the G zone in most Tachikaze decks. Well, for this one specifically, because we don't gauge outside of Reggie, Blue, and Shooter, it's not really incentivized for you to go into Nebros even at all. Nebros is mainly just flip fodder or just a last minute stride that you need to go into if you have nothing else. So Gluttony Dogma is just better here, and 1 Gluttony Nebros for the niche scenarios that you might want to go into it. For example, if you need to hit as many heals as possible that turn, but you also don't want to pressure too much, Nebros is still the stride for you, as you don't really care about giving up that 10k for 1 less drive. You just want to go through your deck as much as possible, drive checking as many heals as possible. In the case that you also need to retire along with the restanding Vanguard, Nebros is still there for you. But you definitely do not need to go into this more than once, otherwise you deck out way too fast. As weird as it seems, 1 Giga Nodo, even though it's the win con of the deck, you actually only go into it once. And usually if you can't kill off of it, your other strides will clean it up for you. Generally, after 1 Giga Nodo turn, you won't have soul afterwards anyways, so there's no reason to have a second one in there. If you have no soul, what's the point of having the stride, right? 1 Vulcan Tyranno, our GB8, which allows us to hit really big numbers really hard and for free for the most part, while also basically being a PG check to your opponent, as for the most part they use all of their shield on the Giga Nodo turn. Even if you stack 1 or 2 fronts, they usually go through most of their big shields that turn. If they survive and then you survive, you have this last resort as a GB8, and it'll usually eat through your opponent unless, you know, they check OT, hit like 2 heals or something like that. But otherwise, this card is just really strong for applying very free pressure after a resource intensive turn. Wrap it up. 1 Harmonics for the Guardian Shield, nothing else to say there. 1 Dismal because we're a rearguard reliant deck. 1 Genga to allow ourselves to reuse our rearguards in some cases and also acts as protection outside of Dismal. 2 Regal Garter to plus during your opponent's turn, but also to proc Genga in case you targeted 2 cards that can't intercept. 2 Bullish Primer, just because it's the biggest G-Guard. It's really nice. Now that we have the lengthy portion out of the way, let's get into some of the how-tos of the deck. To start off, let's cover the Mulligan. Generally, you'll always keep Gaia, Mega X, and Shooter in your starting hands, as these are your grades 1, technically not 2, and grade 3 ride. And if you have these, then you always want to keep a secondary grade 2 to ride, and possibly a grade 3 depending on if the deck you're playing against has a rush or not. You really only want to keep this grade 3 for the Arch Raider discard fodder, but if you can't do that and your opponent's going to be rushing you, then it's definitely a better idea to put it back. Otherwise, you can keep a Prison Bird or a Regiodon/Root Sprint if you're trying to go for early game combos, but everything else should be put back. Onto rides, of course, Shooter's still going to be your grade 1 ride. This card is just the best grade 1 ride in the entire clan, and it allowing you to see more cards, put cards early on the board, and set up for your next few turns is great. Now, your Shooter call will of course depend on your hand, as everything kind of depends on your hand in this deck. If you really want to aggro your opponent, you either call a Megarex on your first turn if you're going second with a blue sprint, or if you're going first, then you probably want to call a Regidon or blue sprint. Otherwise, you can call like Prison Bird or any extra card you have in your hand just to filter it out. But if there's nothing that you want to call in your hand and you just want to keep everything and you went second, it's probably best for you to call the Quick Shield. You can call the Quick Shield off of the skill. So the only thing it does is it poofs out of your hand, but also you don't gauge. You want to have the mentality of gauging as little as possible in this deck. And so calling the Quick Shield is always a good line if you don't have anything to call. You definitely don't want to be wasting gauge, as that automatically takes it out of your deck. You can't use it anymore, and it just goes to drop zone if you gauge into something useless. For a grade 2 ride, you actually want to ride anything that's not Megarex. I know, it's weird, but you want to save Megarex for your turn 3 when you go into Gaia. Simply because Megarex goes from a draw 1 to a draw 2, and that's actually a very big deal. So usually you'll be riding Regidon or Dilopha Pyro in this case. I mean, if you have 3 Megarexes in your hand for whatever reason, even if you have 2 sometimes, you can still ride the Megarex and try to combo off on your opponent. But for the most part, you'll just be riding one of the other 2 grade 2s, swinging and passing. And then, of course, for the grade 3, always want to ride Gaia. Then you go into Arch Raider so that you can proc Gaia's on stride skill. The only thing that you really call before then is Prison Bird or Dialo, just to see more cards for like revive targets or for pitch fodder for the Arch Raider itself. But otherwise, you don't really call anything before. The Excel 2s will do the work for you. Now, in terms of revive priorities to put Gaia's on-stride skill on, it goes in this list. You want to put it first on Megarex number 1, and then if you have a second one, you put on that next. Otherwise, if you don't have that, you either put it on your first Tyrannolegend or your first Regi or Blue Sprint. And then if you don't have a Megarex, you'll put the second one onto Tyrannolegend number 2, or you put it in Regidon Blue Sprint number 2. And then everything else is after that. Sometimes if you don't have Megarex, Tyrannolegend, or Regi Blue, then you might not want to use a skill at all and just try to farm that turn. Do as much as you can and then try to see what you can do the next turn. After this, of course, stride order is what is going to be dictating your matchups and how you play them out. And so the general template for you to go into is something like Arch Raider in your turn 3, go into Dogma or Nebros on turn 4, and then Giganoto on turn 5. Or you can go into Devastate instead of Dogma and Nebros and then go into Giganoto for your kill turn. In very niche scenarios where you have to pressure the entire time, like your opponent just isn't dying, but you also aren't dying, you can go into something like Arch Raider, into Dogma or Nebros, into Giganoto, and then finally close it out with Vulcan Tyranno, the GB8, or you can substitute Dogma and Nebros for Devastate. In our final section, I'll be covering Tyrannolegend Usage, as this also is a little hard for people to pick up on. Typically, you don't want to use Tyrannolegend every single turn. You want to do it on turns that actually matter, and Tyrannolegend would actually be worthwhile for. And to help you, here are a few questions that you can ask yourself to see if Tyrannolegend is a good fit for you in this specific scenario. Number 1. Are there enough rearguards on board after the revive to fully benefit from the front stack? My general rule of thumb is that if there aren't more than 2 standing rearguards after checking the front, then it's not particularly worth it to use the effect. At that point, you just want to rely on normal triggers to buff up their power. Really, 2 rearguards or less, you can just stack the triggers you check from your drive check onto them. And so at that point, a front doesn't really have too much value. Number 2, is the discard worth it to stack a front? If you're discarding something like another trigger that isn't a front or a PG for the front stack, then it's probably not worth it. At this point, you prefer to farm hand and try to do it next turn instead of trying to shotgun the front this turn, so that you have more stability, more consistency, and maybe you drew into better cards to abuse the front with. And lastly, number 3, is it worth it to push damage onto the opponent? If your opponent's at low damage and you want to push them to 3 or 4 for an easier kill, then by all means, you can do it. However, if they're a deck that can use their counterblast well, then you might want to abstain from pushing damage. Against decks like those, you'd rather try to check multiple heals than to push them high in hopes of them not being able to kill you on the crackback. Usually people who do this will generally die because they gave their opponent too much damage, or they just didn't set up enough defense to survive their next turn. And that's it for the video. Overall, I think this has to be my favorite Tachikaze variant in Premium. It's consistent, It's stable, it draws a bunch of cards, and it has an insane kill turn. If you liked it as well, make sure to follow me on Twitter to keep up with any Tachikaze decks that I've been brewing. Otherwise, you can find me on Discord under the same username and on Metafy if you're interested in coaching. I don't just do Tachikaze and am able to help you through any deck that you might be having trouble with. Until my next video that may or may not be in another year, peace. You know, sometimes I wish I could insult Tachi lists, like, publicly. That'd be really cool.
So true, bestie.
Real.
Dude.
What do you mean? You just dropped a fucking manifesto in the boys' DMs, dude. Gave him a fucking 8-item itemized list of why that dude's dog shit. What do you fucking mean, bro?